All right, I'm going to be tearing into a 2013 Suzuki King Quad 750 motor. You'll be able to use this video for the 500 as well as the 450 and the 700s. They're all going to be real similar. Some of the exact same lower end parts. The cylinder heads are going to be slightly different. Obviously, the cylinder and the piston are going to be different sizes, but you should get a general idea how this motor looks on the inside after we're done shooting this video. So I'm going to tear into the top end first. I'm going to move down to the cylinder here, the piston. I'm going to get into the charging system, and then I'm going to split the case here. And I'll break this video up a couple different ways so that you're not having to watch the entire video if all you're needing to do is get into your charging system, or if you need to just split your case there. I've shot several videos on replacing clutches on the other side, rebuilding clutches, replacing that belt, removing those, and showing you exactly how to do that. If you are needing to get into the charging system, I've done another video on how to replace the stator and the flywheel. The reason why we're tearing into this motor is because we've got just a very, very small knock in the bottom end. I'm assuming it's crank, but I'll show you that when we get down in there. But if you're needing a charging system video, make sure you check that out on our YouTube channel. I've done a couple different tests on the charging system here, these wires, the stator down here, obviously your flywheel, how to remove that. I'll also include in the details below the tools that we use when removing the flywheel in particular. It takes a special puller. I want to make sure you guys get the right one, so we'll put that link below. Make sure you use that link because there are hundreds of different flywheel pullers out there, different thread pitches, different sizes, different puller lengths, and I want you guys to make sure that you don't, when removing your flywheel, I don't want you to damage your crankshaft, because you may only need to remove your flywheel, you end up damaging your crank, now you're splitting your bottom end there. One other thing to note here, if you're just rebuilding your top end or your charging system, you do not need to pull your motor. Some people, it's easier to have it on the bench, have it right here in front of you so you can see exactly what you're doing. In the video that we've replaced the charging system, on the other King Quad videos that we've done, the motors are still in the four-wheeler. This one here, obviously motor is out, and the reason why the motor's out is because we're gonna have to get into this bottom end, I'm assuming. So stick with us, we'll show you exactly what to do to get into that bottom end. If you guys have questions or comments, make sure you leave those below. If this video's been helpful, please give us a thumbs up. We want to continue making videos that you guys can use and help you guys figure out how to work on your own ATVs. Thanks for watching. All right, to remove our top cover off of our cylinder head here, it takes a 6mm Allen. I don't like to just use an impact right off the bat. I like to loosen these up and then use an impact if you want to speed things up. I do like the DeWalt 20-volt impact driver there. It works really, really slick. I feel like it's not too much power to where you're breaking bolts off, but it's enough power to remove most of the bolts that you need. I also have the 1/2-inch drive, which works better for larger bolts and nuts there, and just a little more power. But for these Allen bolts, again, those are 6mm Allens, and they are a specialty bolt, so make sure you keep those together with the head cover. You also have little seals here that can be removed. You can just take and pry those up, or if they're sticking in here and they're sealing just fine, you can just leave those. That's not an issue leaving them. Now we've got around here a rubber gasket, and that'll seal this cylinder head cover really, really well. So sometimes it'll take a small rubber mallet or a dead blow to push this off, or sometimes you can just take your fingers there and push up on it, and you should be able to lift that up. You don't want to damage or break this top nipple here, as it's a vent for your motor, and you don't want to break that off or you'll be replacing that. To replace it, it's just 2 8mm bolts on either side here. If you take and push it up like that, that is your cylinder head cover. Underneath of here, you've got your camshafts. So you've got an intake here and exhaust here. Now, if you're going to adjust your valves on this model, you'll find top dead center, and I can do a totally separate video on that if you would like. I don't want to take you guys' time showing you how to adjust the valves if you don't need to right now, but an inspection cap here, pull this cover off, you'll spin your motor over that way, you'll find top dead center, and then you'll check valve clearances. You'll then remove your camshafts here. Obviously, before you do that, remove your tensioner here. and then replace those shims. I can show you those when we get a little bit farther in here. And then if you need to go up or down a couple different sizes, you can put those in there, put our caps back on, put our cams back on, put our cam holders back on, install your caps here and here, obviously your cylinder head cover, and that is how you adjust your valves. I guess I skipped a small step. Double check that those valves have the right clearances after you put the new caps in there. Sometimes what I like to do is spin that crank around a couple times to get those shims in there and seated properly. Sometimes if they've got just the tiniest little piece of grit underneath of them, they won't completely seat until you spin that piston over a couple times and then check those tolerances again. So again, intake, exhaust, and before we pull those camshafts and the camshaft holders here, I like to remove our cam chain tensioner. That's going to take a 5mm Allen. Go ahead and remove that. The other thing that you can do is remove this 10mm, and it's right there. You can remove that, but you are going to have to remove these Allen bolts anyway. So remove that. That's going to pull your spring out, and there's a little rod down in there. Make sure you keep that together. Also make sure that that O-ring is on there. That way it seals those pieces up there. But like I said, again, you do have to remove this anyways, because your cam chain tensioner is not actually going to unlatch itself until you completely remove this. And you can see there how it is. It's an automatic tensioner, so it'll go in. It's just spring loaded in with that spring that we removed, but coming back this way, you've actually got to take and push that lever in. So we can push it all the way in right now. That way when we go back together, we put that spring, that pin, and that screw on here. It's going to actually push on that guide and tighten up your cam chain. This has got a gasket right here. Make sure that gets replaced when you're going back together. Now that you've got your cam chain tensioner out, you should have some tension on your cam chain. Now you'll be safe to remove your camshaft holders. 8mm bolts there. What I do just to speed things up, I'll grab a 8mm, put a conversion between a 3/8 and a 1/4 inch, and I'll just impact these bolts off. I do this in a crisscross pattern so that you don't ever put too much tension on one side or the other of these cam holders. All right, once you have those bolts loosened completely, you could actually take them out and remove them if you'd like. I like to keep them here and just be careful removing them. That way we know exactly which bolts go where. I do believe they're all the same size. It looks like it, but this way it just kind of keeps them in place. You want to make sure that these dowel pins stay in place there. We'll set those cam holders aside. There's two places that you can get your fingers underneath of here to pry up. What you don't want to do is take a screwdriver and pry up on these, or you might end up damaging different areas there. So we've got our cam shafts exposed now at this time. The nice thing about this is a lot of times the cam chain will go over top of these cam shafts. That's not the case with these. So you're actually just going to be able to remove these without actually removing your cam chain. Exhaust cam here, and you'll be able to tell it's the exhaust cam because it's got the automatic decompression here. You want to make sure that that springs properly, make sure it goes back to where it needs to go before you put that back together. But that is your automatic decompression lever there. And same thing with our intake. It doesn't have the automatic decompression, but we'll take and set that aside. Now we're going to remove our plug here. That's going to drop our cam chain sprocket down into place. Then we can go ahead and remove our cylinder head bolts there. All right, we have a 10mm Allen bolt here on the side of our cylinder head. We're going to use a wrench to loosen this up to start. Like I said, then we can grab an impact if that's what we want to do. But I don't want to round this off by using an impact to start. These are sometimes extremely tight. I can get you the torque specs going back together here for this. But just based on the size, a lot of times they are extremely tight, so I don't like to use our impact driver. Small cap here, and it does have a seal. So you want to make sure that that comes out with the bolt here, or at least you keep track of where it goes. Okay, now we've got it down far enough to where we should be able to lift our chain off, and I just pull up on one side or the other and just kind of roll that off of there, and then you can take your gear and slide it up. Now, if you are not going down very far into your bottom end, you want to make sure you hang on to that chain. A lot of times what I do is take a zip tie, tie it to it, that way we can grab it just in case it does drop down. because you don't want that to drop all the way down into your bottom end, and then you have to tear into it farther because you let that go. So keep that in mind. You want to hang on to this cam chain if you're not going down into the bottom end. There's our cam shaft sprocket there. And because we are going down into the bottom end, I'm just going to let this drop. Now, that being said, before we go any farther, you need to know that you do not want to turn your motor over without hanging on to this, because what happens is if you get down in here and you start turning your motor over, this cam chain can get bound up and it can damage your crankcase and your bottom end. So don't turn your motor over if you're just going to let this go. All right, next we've got a handful of 12 millimeter bolts for our cylinder head, and then we also have some 10 millimeters. So I'll show you where those are at. I'll start with the 12 millimeter here. Okay, we've got 4 inside of the cylinder head here. We've got 1 on the outside. Okay, that is all the 12 millimeter. Now we've got 10 millimeter. All right, these are a little bit more tricky because they are so tight to the sides here. You can't get a 10 millimeter impact socket on there. So a couple different things you can do. I like to grab our 1/4 inch extension here with our 1/4 inch 10 millimeter socket here, and then I can still use my impact. The other thing that you can do is just grab a thin walled 3/8 drive impact socket, and you can probably slide it down in there and get it off as well. Have the 4 10 millimeter bolts off of there, or at least we have them loosened up completely. And by the time we get all of those loosened up, our cylinder head is actually separating right here at our cylinder head gasket. We've got a water sensor here, so keep an eye on that so we don't break that. We've got our intake boot. Our throttle body sits here. I've showed you that in several other videos. So you want to make sure you keep an eye on those. You don't rip or tear that boot there. And then you also have this hose that's going down to our water pump clear down here. This is our thermostat. There's no reason to pull this at this time, but I'll just show you what it looks like underneath of there. We've got 6 millimeter Allen bolts here. And we might have a little bit of coolant drip out when we remove this. All right, we've removed the 2 Allen bolts there. There's our thermostat cover there. Here is our thermostat. And I don't think there was any issues with this. I've showed you how to test these. Make sure you check that video out if you feel like you've got a cooling problem. Going back together, you just want to make sure that that seal goes in there properly. And then I'm just going to take and snug these bolts up just to get them into place there. Okay, I'm going to take this bolt, and just to keep everything together, I'm going to run this one back in. You do want to make sure that you've got there's a spacer here or a washer that is model specific, fits that shaft very, very snugly. You also have a brass seal there, or a brass crush washer that'll actually seal that up like it should be. I'm going to run that back in just to keep track of that. Then I need to remove this hose that's going down to our water pump, and then we'll be able to pull our head off. All right, now we are ready to remove the head. We still have our 4 10 millimeters, so we just don't want to take this head and tip it over. Those will just scatter all over the place. But we can just very carefully remove that. There'll be dowel pins in the bottom of this head there, and that's kind of what's holding us up at this point. Okay, so we've got that cylinder head completely removed. We've got our head gasket here, and then I don't want to tip this over, but I'll lay it on its side so you guys can kind of see what's going on here. There's actually 2 spark plugs in the 2013 and up King Quads. They did that because, like I've gone over in my other videos, those cylinder heads actually get a lot of buildup on them, holding those valves open, and then you lose compression. You have a hard time getting your King Quad to start. So Suzuki did a good thing by adding a spark plug here. It just helps that cylinder to burn more cleanly. The spark plugs are fairly expensive, but you do want to make sure and get those replaced every time you service your four-wheeler. So you're going to set this cylinder head aside. All right, so this gasket we're obviously not going to reuse, so that'll get thrown away. We've got our cylinder here. We've got a cam chain tensioner here. We can pull that out at this time. Might have to wiggle it a little bit out of there because our chain kind of fell down on top of it. Inspect that, make sure that that guide's in good condition. This guide here is actually where the tensioner comes in and pushes against. So you want to inspect that spot. We can't actually remove that guide till we get down into our charging system a little bit farther, but when we get that pulled off, you want to inspect that guide. This is typically the one that's going to wear the most. So we've got a coolant line here that we need to remove, and then we've got two 10 millimeters down here. We can use our 1/4 inch extension with our 10 millimeter socket on the end there. Remove those two. Those are actually the only bolts, the only nuts that we need to remove our cylinder. We've got our radiator hose here that we'll remove. We'll get that hose pulled off of there. I pulled it off the bottom as well just to get it out of the way. We're going to set that aside, and now this cylinder is ready to come off of there. You can see here we've got a little bit of buildup on our piston here. It's not near as bad as what the old ones used to be. To remove the cylinder then, you can just pull it off of there. You can slide the piston up out of the bottom there. So that is what the cylinder looks like there. We do actually have some scoring in our cylinder, so I don't think that's going to be our issue completely. I'm going to check that crank to make sure it feels good. That'd be great if this is as far as we needed to go. And based off of the scoring there, possibly it could be as far as we need to go, but we're going to check this crank here in a second when I get this area cleaned up. Turning into the charging system on this Suzuki King Quad 750s. Again, like I said earlier in the video, it's going to be identical to the Suzuki 450, 500s, 700s, and 750s. Possibly different part numbers. I can get into some of that in the details below. But as far as the charging system, how to remove it, how to get into it, I've done several other videos on that process when the motor was in the four-wheeler. I just thought maybe I'd shoot a video with the motor out so you guys can see all the components maybe a little bit better. We've got here our recoil pull starter cover, and that's typically where it would be. The newer King Quads do not have a recoil pull starter, so they just cap this off. Why they did that, I don't know for sure. It was kind of nice to have a backup there, but at any rate, it's not there, so we got to remove that cover. It's at 10 millimeter bolts all the way around this. There's 4 of them. Once we get those all loosened up, we can take and pull that off. That's what it looks like underneath of there. This is typically where your recoil pull starter cup would be, right here. It's obviously not because we don't have a recoil pull starter. So we need to remove that nut. That's a 14 millimeter. And that is going to be regular threaded, so you will turn that the regular direction to remove it, counterclockwise. Setting that aside, now we've got 8 millimeter bolts all the way around here. To remove our water pump and our impeller cover here, takes 8 millimeter bolts as well. There's a couple of these bolts, and different from the other ones, there's 3 bolts here that actually hold this water pump on. Those are going to be the 8 millimeters. If you're going to break open the water pump, you've got 2 GIS bolts here. There's no need for us to open that water pump up, so I'm just going to remove these 3, and then I'm just going to remove this water pump. There's a hose clamp that we've pushed up here. Now we can just take our hose and rock that off. And our water pump will actually be ready to pull off of there. You can just take it, wiggle it off of there. There is the O-ring that I was talking about. It can be a challenge to pull off of there. There is your water pump gear in behind here. You do want to inspect that. Make sure the seal is good. Replace it if you're rebuilding this motor. Inspect this gear before going back together. Make sure it's got all the teeth there. Make sure it spins freely. I would pull these 2 screws, pull the cover off of here, and inspect that impeller, because you do want that to be in good shape too. Those can either seize up or they can break, fins off in there. You just want to make sure that those are in good condition. To get back to the stator cover here, again, 8 millimeter bolts all the way around. We've already removed 3 8 millimeter bolts to pull the water pump. Okay, including these impeller bolts here, we've got 17 bolts that we needed to remove. So now our cover here is ready to be pulled off. You can grab a rubber mallet and tap on it in a couple different spots. You don't want to grab a steel hammer and just start banging on stuff. That is going to break this aluminum or at least cause some sort of damage. So you don't want to do that, but you can grab a small dead blow. Okay, and then you can just take your fingers here and pull up. I like to get my fingers in between those two surfaces. Be careful, it does have some magnet, some pull in there because of the flywheel and the stator, but a lot of times you can just work it up just like that, and then you get it off far enough there, then you can just pull that. So we've got your shift shaft here, that'll just be able to be pulled out. We've got our stator assembly there. We've got our wire connectors here. If we were going to pull this stator off, it would be 3 Allen bolts and then 4 8mm bolts here. So you got one here, here, there, and there to hold the pulser on there. We'll set that aside for now. Like I said, I've done several other videos on how to inspect that, how to test that, and to look at that charging system. Now in here, you can actually see your cam chain down in here. And like I said before, you do not want to drop that cam chain down in here if you are not planning on tearing this far into your motor, because this is exactly what happens here. It's kind of bound up in here. We have done our best to not spin this motor over. If we were to take and just turn this motor over quick, it would bind this chain up, could potentially break some gears or at least some pieces off of our crankcase. Not something we want to do. So I'm actually going to take it at this point so that we don't damage anything, just so we're not risking it. I'm going to take and lift this up and out of here, set that there like that, so it'll be a little bit harder for that to bind up. We're going to grab a socket here, remove this nut, and then we can pull the flywheel. All right, to remove the flywheel, you're going to need several different tools here. I like the impact driver. I like to use a 1/2 inch. I've got the DeWalt 20 volt, works great, does this entire process without having any issues. You're also going to need a 22mm deep well socket. You're going to need a flywheel puller and then a crankshaft protector cap. Now I'm going to sell these. There'll be a link below. Make sure if you want the proper tool, make sure you click on that link below so that you are getting the exact tool that we are using here. We're getting the exact tool that you need. I've had so many customers that reach out to me because they bought the wrong puller. They've destroyed either their crankshaft here or they've destroyed their flywheel here, both of which are extremely difficult to fix after you've damaged those. So make sure you click on the link below to get yourself a flywheel puller, the correct cap here. If you need the DeWalt 20 volt drills, I can point you in that direction as well. This is, again, I said 1/2 inch drive. This is a 22 impact socket. Those are going to be the tools that you need. So to remove your flywheel, first thing you're going to do is remove this nut here. I like to grab a hold of the flywheel because that will keep your motor from turning. It'll keep this cam chain from binding up. With this 20 volt DeWalt here, you're going to have enough strength to hang on to it. I like to grab a rag or something so you don't tear up your hands, but you can hang on to it and twist it off of there. Pretty simple, just like that. You can probably actually do it with a 3/8 drive, and I'll put a link below for those as well. But I like to use the 1/2 inch just so we know that if somebody over tighten this, put too much thread lock on here, we're not going to have any issues pulling that off. Next thing you're going to want to do is grab this cap here. We're going to spin this on. We're going to spin this on as far as it'll go. And this is your crankshaft that we're spinning this on. The reason why we put this on there is because so many times I've heard of people putting the tool on here without this cap. They're going to tighten up this puller bolt here, and you're going to have to push so hard that it damages those threads on the crank. Or I've heard of people bending that crankshaft, neither of which you want to do. So grab the puller here, then set it over top, start threading it on. It's going to thread onto the flywheel there. Make sure you're going the correct direction. Make sure you're getting those on there straight. You want to make sure that it's completely tightened up on here. Thread it on as far as it'll go, and then when it's on there, just give it one last jerk to make sure that it's completely seated. Now you'll grab again with this puller here, it's a 22. You're gonna run this down, and you're gonna start running that down until it hits. And I like to keep my hand on the actual flywheel for a couple reasons. One, so it doesn't spin over, find that chain. Two, you need to know when that snaps off of there, when it pulls off of there. So you can fill it there, and sometimes it'll just be a quick snap off of there. Sometimes you've got to really impact this on there to pull it off. Sometimes I've had where you've actually got to take a hammer and tap on this. What that does is kind of slams it down onto that crank there, or slams that puller down onto the crank there, and it'll jerk the entire thing off. You will not be able to remove that until you pull this puller off of here. And then you remove this cap. This cap here that's threaded onto your crankshaft is holding your flywheel on completely. So don't just sit there and continue to impact this on there, or what you're going to be doing is pulling this cap that's threaded on here, you're going to be trying to pull against those threads on the crank. And it'll be like, may the best man win, because either your flywheel puller here is going to give out, or the threads on your crankshaft cap are going to give out. Either way, you're going to break some stuff, so don't do that. Pull your flywheel there. There's your one-way gear, and behind there, when you hit your starter motor that's right here, it's going to turn this starter limiter gear. It's going to turn this idle gear. It's going to spin this over, and because this is directional, it's going to spin this in the direction that it needs to turn. It's going to turn your motor over. You let off your starter motor, this gear is going to stop, this gear is going to stop, and this gear is going to stop. So these gears are no longer needed when that starter is not turning over. That being said, you still need this flywheel to spin, so that is why you have the one-way gear on here. So if it is catching in either direction, your starter is just going to continue to spin over because this idler gear and this idler gear are going to be spinning your Bendix gear here, or your starter limiter here, and you're going to wear out that starter very, very quickly. So flywheel here, Woodruff key here, and I like to grab either a screwdriver and kind of tap on that to push that out, or you can grab side dikes and just kind of pry it out. This gear is not going to be able to be pulled off until that Woodruff key is out of there. Okay, once you get that Woodruff key out of there, I like to take and set that with the flywheel, because the flywheel is magnetic. You can just leave that there, you won't lose that. Our gear can come off. I want to show you this here quick. You put this gear on here, and sometimes it takes a little bit of wiggling back and forth to get that on, and it should only spin one direction. You can see we're trying to spin it both directions. It'll only spin that direction. So sitting on your motor, if you can see, it'll only spin that direction, and that's the direction that it needs to go. I don't know which way is going to help you know which direction it needs to go, but sitting here on the hand, this flywheel is spinning freely counterclockwise. It's not spinning clockwise. If you have it flipped over like this, just so you can see here, it's spinning counterclockwise. It does not spin clockwise. So hopefully that gives you an idea which direction that needs to go on when you're going back together. Now we have our cam chain exposed here. We can remove that. You can see the area here that I was talking about that could be damaged if we let that cam chain get bound up. We can now remove our other guide here. Both of our starter drives here, our Bendix gear and our starter drive, those can be removed. Remove our other cam chain guide. This is where the tensioner put pressure on the actual guide itself. So the tensioner here is slid in here like this, and it'll push against here. So you want to inspect this area, make sure it's not grooved. Sometimes what happens is the amount of pressure that's coming from the cam chain actually will wear a spot on your guide here. So your tensioner will appear to be completely stretched out and out of tension, but it's actually the guide that's the problem. So keep an eye on that. A lot of times if I'm ordering a cam chain tensioner, I will also order this guide here, because you don't want one to be worn out and the other one is just going to be shortly behind. So remove this bolt here, 6mm Allen. I don't like to use an impact on these for the same reason I told you up above there, is you just run the risk of stripping these out, and then you have a really hard time completely removing these. Once we get it loosened up enough, I'll grab my socket here and I'll start just turning this out. Because of thread lock on here, these can be extremely tight. That being said, going back together, you do want to make sure that you put thread lock on there. There's your bolt there. You've got a washer behind there. Make sure that that goes back on. It's a specialty bolt here. It's got the collar on there and the thread. This needs to fit snug on there. Remove some of the gears now on the left-hand side of this King Quad 750 motor. We've got a gear up here. We've got your crank gear. We've got your oil pump that's here. Another gear back here. These two gears here are for your balancers. They've got dots right here that need to line up with your crankshaft gear. The reason why they have those, so everything can be in time there and running smoothly. Otherwise, your engine is going to shake really bad. It's going to make all kinds of noise. You're going to end up having some serious issues. So remove these. These are 14 millimeter bolts here. We also have a couple snap rings like here. Your oil pump that we'll remove. Set that one down. We've got one back here on your transmission gear. And that one is removed. We've got your shift detent up here. Some people call them a shift star. And then here's your spring-loaded arm. Those can be pulled off with a 10 millimeter. So that is what the spring looks like underneath of there. Pull that up, just sits right underneath of there like that. And then your shift detent here, you can just pull off. You do want to be careful. There's a peg there that will slide out of there when we flip this motor over, so just keep that in mind. 14 millimeter bolts here. Both of those can be removed. They've got larger washers on there. Make sure you keep track of those. This larger gear here, you won't be able to pull out until after we split that case. This is for your bevel gear, your transfer gear. So there's actually going to be a gear and a nut on the back side of this, and that's what transfers the power from this way to front and back. So that is called a bevel gear or a transfer gear, middle drive gear, and like I said, that's going to control the output shafts going front and back. This, we're going to be able to pull off your oil pump gear. And then your chain as well. We'll keep this together. This pin, you can see there, is starting to slide out. We just want to keep that with our oil pump. So I'm going to set this oil pump gear aside. This sprocket here, I'm going to set with the actual chain itself. And then we do have another woodruff key here. You saw me just pull this this balancer gear off. That woodruff key will slide down there. You can see the direction that that gear needs to go. The coupling part of it is down. Setting that aside, same thing over here. This gear can be pulled off. Watch that woodruff key. It actually slid off with the gear. So I'm going to grab that. Woodruff keys are nice because that only gives you one place to put those gears. You cannot put those gears the wrong angle or the wrong place. They can only go on one way. Setting those aside, this gear we'll be able to pull off. There's a spacer in behind here. Make sure that stays with that. And I'm going to take this larger snap ring, set that with that gear. The smaller one is going to go on this oil pump, but we'll remove this quick before we do that. Oil pump, grab our impact driver. This is a Matco tool here, and we've got the right bit on there. Take and we'll spin these off. Get those loosened up, what I like to do then is grab my impact. Now you can only do this if you've got a good bit, if you got a good hold on there, and you got a good impact. So I like to put a lot of pressure on here, spin these off. Keep an eye on that pin. We could actually have taken it out. It does hold another washer on there. I'm just going to leave it on there and just keep an eye on it. We had an O-ring, or we had a spacer drop down. There's a spacer up here. I'm not sure if that's where that one went. There's also a spacer on this gear as well. So I'm going to take those off, and I'm actually set those with the actual gears. We don't want those getting misplaced. If you put your entire motor back together, put those in the wrong place, your motor may not shift properly, it may not start or turn over properly. All three of the oil pump bolts are off. So we're going to remove that oil pump. There'll be some oil still in there. We'll set that, let it drain, and we'll kind of put those parts all back together. So this here, we do not actually have a special tool for. I'm going to show you how to remove this nut without using a special tool. We've got a little dinged up area of this nut here. That's just to keep that nut from loosening up. So what I like to do is grab a chisel with a fairly flat end on it and a hammer, and then I'm gonna replace this. So when we go to order a crankshaft, I'm actually gonna just order another nut for this as well. If I were to have a special tool from Suzuki, they're quite expensive, and I can put a link below if you would like that tool. I don't actually ever use one, I just replace that nut. If you replace that nut, they're $20 or so. All right, you can take it, start loosening that up. It really doesn't take much. You don't hardly damage that gear at all, but I would suggest replacing it every time. Sometimes I've seen where people have straightened these out and reused them. I just don't like running the risk. If one of these where you're kind of hammering it on or chiseling it, if one of those lobes were to break off, you could have some serious damage down in your bottom end. So like I said, I just replace it. That way we know it's new and we know it's good. You thread lock it, you ding up that area that I told you about, and you don't have to worry about anything else. All right, we'll finish unscrewing that nut. That'll just slip right over our sprocket here. That's actually part of our crank. We'll get that removed. We'll set that aside. Now we can lift this gear up. You do have another fine washer below that nut there, between that gear and that nut. So set that aside. Okay, one more thing before you go and start removing your crankshaft here, splitting your case. You do have a small pin that's running through your crank that we need to remove. If you don't get this pin removed, you're gonna have a difficult time splitting that crankcase. So make sure you get that pulled. Got that removed there, set that aside. Now we are ready to go to the other side, pull our crankcase bolts that are around the outside here, and then we can split this case. All right, tearing into the centrifugal clutch system on the King Quad 750. This is going to be similar to the 450, the 500, the 700, and the 750. This is a 2013, like I said, and I've showed you how to remove and replace and rebuild these clutches here. The front primary clutch, the secondary rear clutch. This would be the driven clutch, and this would be the drive clutch. And I've showed you how to replace that belt. I showed you the tools that you need. And now I'm going to dig a little bit farther into this clutch assembly here. If all you are doing is replacing your centrifugal clutch or your centrifugal clutch housing here, maybe a seal, maybe a gasket, and behind here, you don't actually need to pull this engine to do this job. We are replacing the crankshaft, so while we're doing that, I'm just showing you how to remove and replace a handful of other parts on this motor. If this video has been helpful, make sure you give us a thumbs up. We'll try to get listed below all the tools that we use on this job. Also, some of the part numbers for some of the parts that you'll need, the gasket kits, the piston kits. We offer a lot of those parts and tools in our eBay store or our website. Check the links below for that. Thank you guys for watching. We've got a sensor here that we're gonna pull, and it just held on by a little wire keeper there. We've got two 4mm Allens to remove this sensor. Loosen these up, and then we can get this removed. Just get it out of the way to start. Now to replace your clutch, you don't actually have to remove this sensor, but I just need to get this done anyways. So removing this, and then after we get our centrifugal clutch pulled apart here, I'm also going to tear into the bottom end here and get that crank shaft removed and pulled and replaced. So there's our sensor there. Cleaning that up, you've got a couple different brass areas here that'll make contacts. That'll send those to your indicators on your dash. We've got an O-ring that'll seal this sensor up. We'll pull that. Now we'll get into the 8mm all the way around here. I just like to use a 20-volt DeWalt 3/8 drive with a 3/8 to a 1/4 inch adapter, 1/4 inch extension here with an 8mm socket. All right, we got 12 bolts around the outside here. Looks like different lengths. Okay, so our two long ones go here and here. These are the two long 8mm bolts that we've pulled out, and they're just slightly longer. There's your longer ones, there's your shorter ones. So not a lot of difference, probably 3/8 of an inch. Set those aside. Now we can grab a rubber mallet, tap up on this. You do want to make sure don't tap too hard, don't break this housing here. And it shouldn't take much. There is a gasket in there that kind of seals things up, but it really shouldn't take a lot of persuasion there to pull this cover. And there is your centrifugal clutch. There's your centrifugal clutch housing there. This is what I call the housing. I've done several other videos on how to remove this housing out of this case. I'm gonna let this sit on the bench here and drain the oil out of it. Here's your gasket. Make sure you get that replaced every time you tear into this. Clean this up really well, get a new gasket, replace it. We've got your one-way bearing here. Now, you see if you order a stock one, which I would suggest doing, the arrow will be going clockwise. It'll also say outside here. Also have a green dot. This side does not have a green dot. So, arrow going clockwise, says outside, it's got a green dot. That's how you know you're going the right direction. So you want to make sure that that is in good condition. Inspect that really well. Make sure there's no flat spots or any damage to that bearing. Set that aside. Pull our centrifugal clutch pack off of here. Okay, this is going to be a 15/16 impact here. Impact socket. Again, hang on to it with our hands. All right, so this is actually going to be reverse threaded. So to loosen this up, you're going to go clockwise. So not the same way you would loosen up most bolts. Turn it clockwise. Your impact needs to be going clockwise to remove this bolt. All right, we've got that bolt removed. It is red thread locked on there. So it is actually very, very hard to pull that off of there. Thankful we've got our 1/2-inch drive DeWalt here. That had allowed us to pull this off of here. Again, turning it clockwise. And the reason why, a lot of times you know that, like this nut here is grooved. You can see on each ridge here, it's got a little groove in it. That tells us that we need to be turning it the other direction. So set that aside. Now we can remove our centrifugal clutch. All right, now that we have our centrifugal nut off of here, what you need is a puller that looks similar to this. I do also have these available. Click on the link below to make sure that you've got the right one for the right job. Again, I've got countless people that tell me they've really screwed up the threads on their crank or their clutch because they have used the wrong puller. And then what you do is take this, thread this in then and pull it up just like your flywheel would be. Take and pull this up and this will actually just all come out like this. Your puller will come out with it. And unthread your puller here and your clutch is off of there. And that's what your centrifugal clutch looks like. So if you have any questions on that, make sure and leave the comments below. This washer is going to be in there. Here is your nut. Here, I'm going to keep that all together. You do want that to go back in that same order there. Don't forget about your nut there. So got the centrifugal clutch off. Now you guys have all the right tools for this job. Next, to split this crankcase, we're going to remove the piston off of here. Our prop shaft we're going to disassemble. But first I need to remove all the 8mm bolts. There's also 12mm bolts, 2 in the back here, 1 up front here in front of the cylinder, 1 behind the cylinder, and then there's going to be 2 right here inside this crankcase cover. There's going to be 2 more 12mm bolts. The rest of those are going to be 8mm. I've got 13 8mm bolts is what I've counted. Let me know if that's different from what you've got. If you've got less bolts than that, I would definitely do a little more searching to make sure that you found them all. If you've got more bolts than that, let me know because I need to do a little more searching. So go ahead and pull those bolts. Now, what I like to do, obviously put these in bags or some sort of container when you're, so that when you're going back together, all those bolts are already organized. Now, if we're going right back together with it, what I'm going to do is do like I did for our centrifugal clutch housing. I'm just going to set those in order. So I'll maybe start in the back here, pull both of these, and then I'll just go all the way around in order. There's going to be several different sizes here. So we're going around the outside. There's going to be 1 down in there. Okay, that's all the outside ones. I'll also keep the wire clip on there. That kind of gives us an idea where those were at. Now we can finish them out and grab these in the middle. Now we've got our bolts completely lined up in order, the exact way that they were taken off. I don't think we've missed any. All of them are in order. If you need to take a picture, you can. If you're not putting those back together right away, I would suggest labeling them somehow. I'm going to slide these aside so we can continue on with our crank. Our motor mounts here, you can pull these off if they haven't fallen off already. These are just rubber dampers here for your motor mounts. Those will come off when you're pounding on that motor anyways. So grab a rubber mallet or a dead blow hammer here, and now you can just take and tap on a couple different areas here. All right, if you've done that much tapping and nothing has moved, you've obviously missed a bolt or two. Go back over, inspect everything, make sure that you found all the areas so that you're not damaging your transmission or your crank here by tapping on them. Now, if you have gotten all the bolts, your crankcase will start splitting apart, and that's been the case here with this one. It's going to start splitting apart. I like to grab in an area where you can hang on to it, and I like to hang on to the case, the front half, so that your back half can kind of keep sliding out. So once you've gotten that motor to a point where those gears are going to be going one direction or the other, you can kind of determine which way you want your crankcase there. Whatever side you are tapping on, if we're tapping that way on these two shafts here, more than likely this top case is just going to pull right off this direction here, and all your gears are going to stay down below there. So we're going to take now and get our fingers in behind there if we're able to do that, and just start prying that case open with our fingers. You don't want to stick a screwdriver or a pry bar in there, or you're going to damage some stuff. We're going to pry this up. I'm going to be very careful not to just pull all these gears up, because I don't want to lose the position that they were. So I'm going to slide it up very carefully, and now we know exactly where everything is. We've got minimal damage down in the bottom end as far as where these parts go. So we've got a shaft here. If you can see that in the camera view, this shaft is obviously going to be down like so. We have got a washer that I saw fell off some here. My guess is one side or the other, because this side has got a washer. Now both sides have a washer. So both sides of that gear have a washer. There's no other components down here that we dropped because of the way that we pulled that crankcase apart. We've got a balancer gear here and here. And this one actually has got a lip that's going to keep us from pulling that out. And this one I'm going to set with our balancer gears there. We've got our shift drum here. We've got our shift forks and shaft here. We can just pull that up slightly. That'll allow us to get this shift drum out of here. Okay, we can put our shift detent on the end of this. Be careful when tipping this upside down. There are two posts that are spring loaded that can give you a little grief if you are not hanging on to those. Slide that into position there. We can take and run that bolt in there. That'll just help us remember where some of these components go. Again, like I said, keep a thumb over top of those posts. Set that aside. Now we've got our shift forks that can now be pulled out. Those are out. It's going to be pretty obvious where those shift forks go on this gear set. So pull that off there. There is two grooves right here that are going to be where those shift forks go. So pretty easy as long as you know which direction those go in. And I set those in the direction that they come out. I'm going to set that all inside there so we know. Now this shaft is just going to pull out as well. Got to wiggle these back and forth sometimes, but that will just come right out of there. We got some liquid gasket there. Make sure going back together you utilize some liquid gasket. That shaft is out. We've got this bevel gear that I talked about earlier. Now we can go ahead and remove that nut there. We can then pull that gear off this way, push that shaft out this way. This screen here, you want to clean that out really good. Make sure there's no particles in that when you're going back together. You've got your output shaft here. This is going to your rear. This is going to your front. So the rear, we can actually just take and pick up on that. We've got a seal that's going to come out with it. We've also got a bearing here and here to remove these gears, you need to remove that nut on the end there. I can tell you a size here in a second on that. All right, there is our rear output shaft. I'm going to set that aside. I'll give you a little more details on that here in a bit. I'm going to remove this idler gear, keeping in mind we've got a washer down below there. Both sides of this gear look identical. I don't think it matters which direction goes in first. We've got our crankshaft now that we'll set this motor up, and we'll just tap the other side of the crankshaft out, and that'll push that crank out. And then our prop shaft, we'll get that removed as well. All right, finishing up on the King Quad here, I'm going to remove this rear prop shaft from the actual output shaft here. So I'm going to show you how to do that, as well as remove this gear out of our transmission. Our crankshaft we pulled out. We just tap that out with a rubber mallet here. We've got our other balancer that we're going to set with our other balancer and geared parts. Your bevel gear here that I showed you is going to be a 27 millimeter socket, and that's going to be on here. What I like to do again is grab the other side here. Otherwise, if it's just going to spin, it's not going to do any good. So you've got to actually have quite a bit of pretty good grip on this one here, and then we can remove this. So spin that right off of there. If you don't have an impact, it's going to create quite a challenge removing that one. That's why we prefer this DeWalt 20 volt impact here. We can go ahead and now slide that gear off there, and then our shaft will slide through the other side. Our shaft is off. I'm going to set our crankcase aside there. We're done with that side for now. I'm going to put this gear back on here. Washer, spacer came off of this side. Take that nut, throw it back on there. Okay, that is half of our bevel gear. Here's the other half. To remove this side, you need to remove this nut here. Bigger than a 27, that's all I'll say. I believe it's probably a 32. Remove that nut. This will all just slide off of here. These two gears need replaced together. So you don't want to replace one without the other. So I'm going to set this aside. I've removed this band here, and then what you can do is actually pull this shaft out of there, and there's a little bit of a seal here. All right, I've pried this boot back a little bit. There's a seal that's right here. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it from where you are, but that's going to kind of hold this on. It's going to hold that shaft in there. So now we're able to pull this shaft out. Now we've got a couple different options here. Obviously, unless this joint is bad, there's no reason to take this all apart. But I'm going to show you what it looks like underneath of here. And then I'm going to point you to a couple other videos where we have replaced prop shafts and U-joints. And there's really no use in me doing that because this joint is good. This boot is good. And I just want to show you what it looks like underneath of here. So be really careful if you are using a pick here, because you don't want to rip that boot. Actually, it would be better using a screwdriver if you can get underneath of it there. A little bit like removing a tire off of a motorcycle. You just kind of work it around there. It's a very stiff boot. Okay, we got it off of there. Now there is our joint. Like I said, we've done several other videos on removing this yoke off of the machine, replacing this U-joint, and then removing that nut there. So if we need to do that, we can. If you guys need me to show you how to do that, make sure and let me know. We can get that done for you. So I'm going to set that aside. We're going to go to the front prop shaft now at this time. All right, we have what looks like a similar situation here. So we've got our boot here. We've got all this joint assembly here. What I'm going to try to do is remove the boot from this right up against the motor here. You can use a flat or a Phillips screwdriver or an 8mm socket to remove this clamp or loosen it up at least. What we need to do is get to these Allens here. So that's what's holding this shaft in. So I'm going to get behind here. Once that clamp is off of there, these boots are very, very thick, very stiff. So try not to rip it here. And there's a lip on this cup that makes them a little difficult to get off of there. Okay, that is off. Now we can get in here and get these Allens out of here, but really I'd like to get this joint removed. It's gonna be the same situation as we had in the back. You gotta pry this, and then we've got that O-ring holding this up here. So, all right, so once you get that boot pried up, what I'm gonna do is take a hammer, get in there, and don't tap on a groove where your boot is gonna sit. There should be a cutout, and I'll show you exactly where to pry once I get this off of here. But if you give it one good shove, it's like a drive shaft would be, or an axle on an ATV. It's got this little snap ring in here that kind of centers itself, so it just takes a little bit of force to give it a shove in there. There's a little bit of a cutout on either side of this yoke, this side and that side there. Either side, you should be able to get your screwdriver in there and just tap on it. It shouldn't take much. If you don't get it on one side, turn it over. You can see the same thing over on this side, another groove there, another cutout for you to get in. So this is the front. Now what we're able to do is get in here with our Allens and undo this. Now if all we're doing is replacing the U-joint again, link below for those videos. I'll show you how to remove those. 5mm Allens here. Okay, we got all of those Allens removed for our front coupling here. Then we should be able to just take and pull that out. There'll be a seal right here that should seal up anything from coming out of your crankcase. All right, you pull that out. That's as far as it'll go. Flip it over, and you can see there what needs to happen. It just needs to be lifted up. Then you can set it down in there, and then pull it out the rest of the way. That's your front drive shaft there. That's your output there on the King Quad 750. And like I said several times in this video throughout, the King Quad 450, 500, 700, and 750 are all going to have almost identical process to all these parts, so you can utilize this video for those machines. If you guys have questions or comments, make sure and leave those below. If this video has been helpful, make sure you hit that subscribe button if you can. Hit that thumbs up. Share it with friends and family so that they too can be helped on some of these repairs. I put links below on some of the tools that we've used. I put links below on other videos that we have on this make and model. Thanks for watching. So that is the crankcase split on a Suzuki King Quad 750. Again, like I said earlier, the 450, the 500, the 700, and the 750s are going to be almost identical to this. I'll probably include those in the title so that people can utilize this video for those engine swaps as well. If you guys have questions or comments, make sure and leave those below. I do appreciate a thumbs up and a subscribe. If this video has been helpful, make sure you leave some feedback so we know what to do better or different next time. And click on those links below if you need those tools and parts that we used on this rebuild. Thank you guys for watching.